I want to deal with early African sculpture, and we're going to be dealing specifically with Nigeria, starting with the Nok. And the Nok is basically central Nigeria. Now, there aren't good maps for a lot of these early societies. It's not clear exactly where that delineation would lie. In many cases, it's because of a lack of study. We haven't really sat down and determined that because most art historians and archaeologists are looking at Europe and Greece and areas that are going to have much more glory associated with them in terms of large discoveries. Whereas in Western Africa, we're not seeing that kind of study, and it is very unfortunate. This culture, the Nok, is generally fairly unknown. We believe that they existed between about 500 BCE to about 200 CE. And we see hundreds of heads that were created. These are animal heads, body parts, figures, as well as human heads, as we're going to see. And we're looking at the Rafin-Kura head, which represents, or is very representative, of Nok terracotta heads. In this case, this was probably part of a full figure. Other parts indicate that these figures were sculpted standing, sitting, and kneeling. So we see just that part, just the head, and you could imagine an archaeologist or quote-unquote explorer going out, finding this head, maybe finding an arm or a foot, but no one really wants to put a foot in a museum, so they bring back the head. We get it out of context, leading to all sorts of issues when you get to the study of these pieces. The heads tend to be much larger than would be proportional to the body. Really common, because wisdom is particularly important, and what better way to symbolize wisdom than to enlarge the forehead? We see a very expressive face with large eyes and flared nostrils. We also see that this is probably stylized. So you don't want to look at these pieces, especially non-Western pieces, and compare them to Western art. You don't want to compare this, for example, to the Venus de Milo or the David or anything like that. We're in a completely different cultural context. They have different ideas of beauty, of aesthetics, of art in general. We see pierced holes, probably there for firing. The function of these sculptures is unknown at this time. Again, that lack of context is really hamstringing a lot of further study into these items. Some aspects in this piece were carved when the clay was hardened, while others were modeled, and you can generally tell based on the level of detail. If you take a piece of wet clay and you model it, you're going to get very soft forms. If, on the other hand, for example, For example, these details in the hair are cut in. You can see how clean that cut is. That's probably done when the clay is leather hard or fully hardened and simply carved out. This may well have been sculpted by a woman, as this is true across the continent. We see a lot of female sculptors working in clay in Africa, especially before the 19th century. We believe that to be the case. Again, because of a lack of context, because of a lack of study, we don't have a lot of good, solid proof for that point. And then we have a second society. By the 9th or 10th century, we see a bronze casting tradition start to develop. So we're a little later in the timeline. We're about 700 years after the Nok head. And we see great sophistication that will develop specifically in lower or southern Nigeria. We see numerous intricate objects in ceramic, bronze, copper, and iron. And in this case, we're looking at this equestrian figure on a fly whisk hilt, or it was part of a fly whisk hilt. On the right here, you see a fly whisk, and then this would be the cap piece just to add an aesthetic to something that's going to be very pragmatic, very functional. Now, this is one of the earliest metalwork pieces that we find in Africa, or that have been found at this point in Africa. And it was made using the lost wax method, something that we're very familiar with in European art. So they would make the piece out of clay, you add your details in wax. The wax has to be as thick as the sculpture will be. You cover the whole thing in clay, you fire it so the wax melts out, you pour in your molten metal, you break the mold, and there you go. You have a sculpture. So that's what they're doing. This is a technique that we don't usually associate with non-Western cultures, except we see it all the time in non-Western cultures. It's this sort of odd myth that the Europeans or Western society are the only ones to do this. Now, if we look at the figure itself, we see the figure is seated on a donkey or horse. You would want to say it's a donkey because it's very small, but they may have shrunk the animal so that your focus is on the person. We see that in other European pieces. The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius or the equestrian statue of Charlemagne, where they again shrink that animal to bring focus to the person on it. After all, no one cares about the horse. And this is a highly embellished handle with bead and thread-like patterns. The head is again exaggerated and enlarged. And we see stripes, specifically along the face. And when we look at those could have a couple of different meanings, but the most likely meaning there is going to be that it represents marks of status. This is a way of marking this person out, possibly as a ruler, king, or god, as opposed to your average person. And we always need those symbols in art, because imagine if you did a painting of, say, the President of the United States, and he's just there in t-shirt and shorts like he would be if he ran down to the beach. Well, there's nothing there to tell us who that person is. So we apply symbols. We put the eagle in the background. We put a suit on them with specific colored ties and all of these sorts of ideas. Same thing is happening here. And a lot of what you're seeing is stylization. So they're altering the features. For example, when you look at the donkey or horse, he's covered with these thread-like patterns. And that may be a show of virtuosity, of skill by the sculptor himself or herself as it's created. So a great deal of skill and effort goes into making this piece and beautifying something as simple and functional as a fly swatter.